Hey guys, my name's Paige, or to some the mischievous Raven, and I'm here to educate you all today about immateriality female artwork. What does it mean to me? Well, immateriality, of course, is opposite to materiality. Some examples of immateriality: we have abstract art, performing art, energy art, spiritual art, and you've also seen videos and television, media art. In some instances, like the forgotten female artists I've chosen to speak about in this video, their work is more of a spiritual thought process rather than something physical. This female artist video has been wrought by a very honest, opinionated and empathic witch who can feel years of oppression from many artists through simply looking at their work. Their pain, frustration, upset, joys. Unfortunately, I can feel it all. Let me do you an educate. Here's some fresh, piping hot tea. Picture this, 1915 Sweden. We are 1 year into the First World War. Sweden, of course, stayed very neutral throughout. During the First World War, women's peace movements had a prominent role with some really strong women. Ellen Key was a feminist public intellectual and an important representative that spoke about education, ethics, children's parenting, women's suffrages and peace. As well as the vocal protesting women in the women's peace movement, Sweden also had a large amount of female writers involved within the movement. Ellen Wagner was one. Ellen was an upcoming novelist who wrote for feminism, peace and nature in World War I. Amazingly, she went on to become recognised in the Swedish Academy as of 1944. Go get it, girl. Amazing. Rosika Schwimmer was a peace activist and Hungarian suffragist. She wrote of peace efforts in many women's magazines, but, nonetheless, as time went on, activist claims were ignored and she was derogatorily tarnished as a peace sheep. Because of course more than one person fighting for what is right is dubbed a sheep, especially when it has anything to do with females. All of these amazingly strong females lead me on to our first artist, the very spiritually gifted Hilma af Klint. Who is Hilma af Klint? Hilma af Klint was a Swedish artist born in Karlberg Palace in 1862 to a middle-class family. She went on to study at the Royal Academy of Fine Arts in Stockholm, and her landscape and portraiture work were rarely exhibited. Her abstract work was never shared, and she wanted to keep them hidden from the world until society was a lot more accepting. Her work had many aspects such as geometry, colour theory and scientific illustration, and her work was inspired by spiritism and theosophy. She quite literally put the spiritual immateriality aspect of her work. Her lifetime consisted of seeing many women from different backgrounds and fields turn to spiritualism due to the gender conventions. And in 1896, af Klint formed a group named De Femme, which is the five in English. In this group, she held meetings and seances. She had many social circles. The Theosophical Society af Klint was part of for a short period of time. This society was established by Helena Blavatsky and Colonel Henry Steele Olcott. Helena Blavatsky was a Russian spiritualist and author known for having extraordinary psychic powers. The London Society for Physical Research declared Blavatsky of being a fraud. However, since then, the Society have revoked what they had accused Blavatsky of being and exclaimed that they had wrongly condemned her. Not much is known about Henry Olcott other than he enlisted in the Northern Army when the 1861 American Civil War began, and then he was the founder of the American Theosophical Society. Theosophy comes under the occult category, and there are various forms used, such as intuition, meditation, and revelation. Most theosophists have a fascination with the supernatural, psychic, and spiritual powers. The Federation later established a Theosophical Society in Sweden in 1895. Cue Hilma af Klint's introduction. After all, she was in Sweden at this time. The Idolvårdsförbundet Edelweiss Society, in English, I think that's correct, There were 5 upper-class or prominent society members. We have Count Karl Frederick Brundt von Bergen, Countess Hulda Elizabeth Constant Mosander Beamish, Bertha Valerius Huldine von Frock Beamish, and her daughter Fanny Malin Huldine von Fock. Karl von Bergen found Helena Blavatsky's writings in the 1880s. This inspired him to move on to spiritualism. The 5 would have gatherings involving meditation, sermon in front of an altar, triangles, crosses with a central rose and a Rosicrucian symbol. They would read from the New Testament and the Bible, they have seances, spirits would make contact with the group leaders. The leaders were referred to as the High Ones, and the contact could be verbal, it could be drawings or writings. She had a very extraordinary life and it was fantastic. Unfortunately, Av Clint died on the 21st of October 1944, nearly 82 years old, in the aftermath of a traffic accident, leaving 1,300 pieces of artwork behind and 250 notebooks that have never been seen before. In her will, she specified her work was to be kept secret for a minimum of 20 years after her death and must never be slit up. And so we move on. 1940s Paris. We have a very post-war period in history. Joyous times of war ending, however very sombre, mourning loss and the economy in tatters. An economy in tatters sounds familiar. Evening Prime Minister. Swiftly moving on. Some female movements were slowly emerging. However, research in this period in time, I did find that women were still not allowed to be judges until 1946. Ludicrous. A silver lining I did find for the females came in 1949 in the form of Simone de Beauvoir, who published her novel The Second Sex. How may this affect women, you may ask? Well, my pretties, The Second Sex was and still is a book detailing the examination of women's oppression and the beginning of contemporary feminism. This was a fantastic move forward for us women, as previously all we were known for was women's work and being human incubators for undeserving and entitled men that decided when we should bear their children. Simone de Beauvoir's examination focuses on the social establishment of women tarnished as the other. The other? What is that, you may ask? The other was a well-known phenomenology created by this man, Edmund Husserl. According to Husserl, the state of being different from and alien to the social identity of a person and to the identity of thyself. Imagine the outrage of being a woman and not wanting to continue living by rules where the men or a society that favours men dictate what you can and cannot do. The outrage. De Beauvoir argues that women have historically been considered deviant and abnormal. She isn't wrong. In my opinion, it seems that the many historical witch trials are just one example of what happens to women when we don't follow the patriarchal views put in place by the men. I believe the entire thing is absurd, and I am so thankful to Simone de Beauvoir for having the courage and using her writing abilities for something good. Which leads me on to our next amazing artist, the one and only Dorothea Tannen. Who is Dorothea Tannen? So Dorothea Tannen was born in 1910 in Illinois, America. She studied in her hometown for a number of years and then moved to study painting at the Art Institute in Chicago. She eventually relocated to New York, where she met an art dealer by the name of Julian Levy. It was later, in 1942, that Max Ernst visited her art studio, where they then began to date, and she later married him. They spent 34 years together and in this time decided to relocate to France in 1956. She loved the countryside and went on a 5-year personal adventure doing soft sculpture. Dorothea was very much a surrealist, abstract artist, and you can tell that by a lot of her work. In 1976, her husband, Max Ernst, unfortunately died, so she decided to return to the United States in the late 1970s. She then went on to write pieces of poetry that were published in several magazines, and unfortunately, as everything does, the circle of life, Dorothea died in New York home on the 31st of January 2012. She was aged 101. She had just published another collection of poems. Truly inspirational and beautiful lady. 1950s female movements in America. I found, well, not an awful lot really. More notable movements started in the 1960s and 1970s. However, I did find a couple of interesting facts from this time period that I thought you guys might like to know. So, after World War II, a lot like Paris, they were making the most of what they had at the time, remembering loved ones they had lost. It was a general time for people to reflect. Society eventually began to understand that us women were more than just chefs, cleaners and nannies, so they introduced household technology into homes to ease the burden of homemaking. Do not be fooled, ladies and gents. Women still had to make everything. After all, it was our work. But we had machines to make the work easier. How kind of them. Life expectancies also began to increase because as we are adults, we started to realise that communication was better than resorting to warfare. Adult choice. The social economic changes were great for females, and the cultural attitude towards women's work began to also change. Gee, we sound like we are onto a winner here, right? Wrong. Wrong. Sexual inequalities were still an all-time high in legal proceedings. 2 steps forward and 4 back for us females, of course. The massive silver lining at this period in time came in the form of the second sex being translated into English. So by 1950, the Queen Beauvoir's novel was now being sold worldwide. This then raised the feminist consciousness, stressing the importance of liberating females, as when we do this, it liberates men. Who would have thought it, eh? Speaking of 1950s, this leads me on to our final artist, the one and only Helen Lundberg. Who is Helen Lundberg, you ask? So Helen Lundberg was born in Chicago in 1908 and later moved to California in 1912. As a young adult, her family thought she would become a writer, but instead she began to take art lessons taught by Losa Fielsen at Stickney Memorial School of Art. Fielsen taught her subjective classicism, or what we know as post-realism. Lundberg later pursued a relationship and went on to marry her art tutor, Losa Fielsen. Until the 1950s, her paintings were mainly post-realism, and then after that she began to look at more geometric abstraction for her work. All of her work was based on some form of reality, but also kept her imagery mysterious and making the viewer question what her work was. Helen continued with abstraction, exploring imagery associated with landscapes, interiors, planetary still lifes and intuitive compositions through the 1960s and 70s. Her final body of work came in 1980s when she created a series of paintings that deal with landscapes and architecture. Helen's 60-year art career was exposing the imaginative world of her own personal mind. Unfortunately, in the late 1970s, Fieldson died suddenly, and Helen's later work became slightly more scattered and a lot more quiet. In 1990, she unfortunately could no longer paint due to poor health, and sadly, in 1999, she died after contracting pneumonia. As you can imagine, it is practically impossible to research female artists in history. And when history itself made it so difficult for female artists, how could anyone speak about the female artists who they never knew existed? It's only very recently that people are actually going out of their way, like myself, to research these women, to look for the female artists that have been lost in the many predominantly male art books within our history, have been shadowed by their husbands, their friends that are, of course, male. I believe that all of these women were absolutely incredible in their own unique way. Interesting, creative, and simply alluring. Every single one of them are absolute queens to me, and they make me so proud to be female. The thought that 3 incredible artists were just simply never recognised enough whilst alive because of their gender is completely wild to me, and it's something that shocks me to the core. My goal was to change that and to give these artists the respect and appreciation and the time that they deserve in the spotlight. For me, the real global pandemic was never the bubonic plague, influenza, nor COVID-19. It was, and always has been, misogyny. Now, I leave you with this. Would this video still be controversial if
a man made it, or would it be simply a work of art and revolutionary?